21 days into what analysts are now formally calling Phase 2 of the Iran war, Washington is preparing what could be its most consequential decision yet, a fresh wave of strikes that officials say could begin as early as this weekend. Tonight, we break down what's actually happening on the ground, what it means for the region, and why capitals from Doha to Berlin are watching this weekend with genuine unease. Stay with us. Good evening. Tonight, we're covering a story that has now entered its 21st consecutive day under what military analysts are labeling Phase 2 of the ongoing conflict between the United States and Iran. This is not a slow-burning standoff anymore. It is an active, evolving military confrontation with direct consequences for global energy markets, regional stability, and the safety of civilians across at least half a dozen countries. Let's begin with where things stand as of today, August 1st, 2026. According to U.S. officials speaking to CNN, the United States is planning new strikes on Iran as soon as this weekend, while Tehran has vowed further attacks on Gulf states. Officials briefed on the plan say the precise scope and potential targets remain undecided, and that the operation could still be called off before it begins. But the political signal from the White House has been unambiguous. President Trump, addressing a cabinet meeting at Camp David, indicated that American operations against Iran are unlikely to wind down anytime soon, and that the United States intends to continue hitting Iranian targets forcefully in the days ahead. On the Iranian side, the message coming out of Tehran has been just as direct and just as alarming. Major General Ali Abdullahi, who now heads Iran's wartime military command, issued a formal statement today accusing Washington of deliberately escalating this conflict into something far larger than a bilateral dispute. He stated plainly that the United States is accelerating efforts to fan the flames of a full-scale regional war, and he further accused Washington of using the capital, resources, and infrastructure of regional nations as cover for advancing both American interests and Israel's broader military campaign. This is a significant escalation in rhetoric. It's no longer just a warning about Iranian territory. Iran is now explicitly framing Gulf host nations as being pulled into a war they didn't choose. Meanwhile, on the ground, the war's daily rhythm continued without pause. Kuwait's air defense systems intercepted a fresh wave of Iranian drones on Friday, aimed at military facilities inside Kuwaiti territory, a now familiar pattern that has defined this conflict for months, and one that puts Kuwait, once again, directly in the line of fire, despite having no direct role in the war's origins. But to understand why this weekend feels different, why officials on both sides are treating the next 48 to 72 hours as a genuine inflection point, you have to understand exactly how we got here, and just how much this war has already cost the region, economically and militarily, before a single new strike has even been launched. This war did not begin 21 days ago. Its origin point goes back to February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated simultaneous strikes against military and government targets across Iran. A campaign that included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader and several senior officials. That single day reshaped the entire security architecture of the Middle East, and the aftershocks are still being felt in every headline we're covering tonight. In the weeks that followed, diplomatic efforts attempted and failed to contain the fallout. The Islamabad talks, mediated with Pakistani and Qatari involvement, collapsed without producing a durable ceasefire. When that diplomatic track broke down, Washington escalated militarily. On April 13th, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports across the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf coast, aiming to choke off Iran's ability to move oil, weapons, and supplies by sea. The numbers behind that blockade are worth sitting with for a moment. By mid-April, U.S. Central Command reported it had intercepted 23 vessels attempting to move through the blockade line, a figure that would eventually climb past 85 intercepted vessels, with 3 ships seized outright. Lloyd's List, the maritime industry's authoritative shipping data source, separately reported that at least 26 vessels managed to bypass the blockade entirely in both directions, a detail that tells you just how difficult it has been for either side to fully control that stretch of water, even with a formal blockade in place. The financial toll of that blockade, according to U.S. estimates, has been staggering, costing Iran roughly $500 million every single day it remains in effect. Think about that figure for a moment. $500 million daily, drained from an economy that was already under sanctions pressure before this war even began. Iran's response was to formally close the Strait of Hormuz again in mid-April, in direct retaliation for Washington's refusal to lift the blockade, a tit-for-tat cycle of economic warfare running in parallel with the physical, kinetic war we've been covering night after night. And here's where I think it's worth pausing the timeline for a moment, because numbers on a page, $500 million a day, 85 vessels intercepted, can start to feel abstract if we don't connect them to what they actually mean. Every one of those intercepted vessels was carrying something: fuel that heats homes, food that feeds families, medical supplies bound for hospitals, or industrial goods that keep factories running and workers employed. When a blockade costs a country $500 million a day, that cost doesn't stay contained within government ledgers and central bank reports. It moves downstream into grocery prices, into fuel queues, into hospital supply chains. This is the part of war coverage that doesn't always make it into an 8-second headline clip, but it's arguably the most important part, because it's the part that determines how ordinary people in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Mashhad are actually experiencing this conflict 5 months in. Let's talk specifically about what a new round of American strikes, if they proceed this weekend, would mean militarily. Based on reporting so far, officials have deliberately kept the scope and target list vague, but analysts tracking this conflict point to a consistent pattern in how previous strike waves have been structured. Earlier phases of this war targeted military command infrastructure, air defense systems, and facilities linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. If this new wave follows that pattern, we could be looking at strikes on Iranian air defense networks that have already been degraded by months of continuous engagement, logistics and resupply routes feeding Iranian forces operating near the Strait of Hormuz, and potentially, based on Iran's own warnings today about critical energy infrastructure, strikes that edge closer to Iran's oil production and export capacity itself. That last point deserves special attention because it represents a genuine escalation threshold. For most of this war, both sides have, with notable exceptions, avoided directly targeting the core of Iran's oil export infrastructure, largely because doing so risks triggering exactly the kind of global energy shock that no country, including the United States, actually wants to manage. Iran's own military leadership referenced this threat directly today, promising retaliation specifically in the event that Washington moves against its energy sites. If the U.S. does strike energy infrastructure this weekend, we would very likely see an immediate Iranian response aimed at Gulf oil and gas facilities belonging to other nations, not just American assets, because Iran has repeatedly demonstrated throughout this war that it views U.S. allies hosting American infrastructure as legitimate, if painful, points of leverage. From a purely military standpoint, this is what makes Phase 2 genuinely more dangerous than the war's earlier stages. In February, this was a bilateral conflict with 2 primary combatants. By August, it has metastasized into a multi-front regional confrontation touching Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, and the UAE. Nations that did not choose this fight, but whose territory and infrastructure have become part of the battlefield by virtue of hosting American forces. So if the military picture inside the region is this volatile, what does the outside world make of it? How are other governments, and just as importantly, ordinary people watching from outside the Middle East, actually reading this moment? That's where we turn next. Let's start with the economic dimension, because this is where the war's global footprint is most immediate and most measurable. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil and liquefied natural gas. On any given day it's fully open. It has not been reliably fully open for months. Every time Iran threatens or executes a partial closure, and every time the American blockade tightens, energy markets in London, New York, and Singapore react. And those reactions ripple outward into fuel prices that affect commuters in Karachi, manufacturers in Germany, and shipping costs for consumer goods virtually everywhere. This is not a regional story contained to the Middle East. It is functionally a global supply chain story with a war attached to it. Now, how are different capitals actually responding? In Europe, the tone has shifted toward cautious, careful diplomacy rather than open alignment with either side's military approach. German Foreign Minister Johann Weidefeld, commenting on related regional developments this week, described emerging signs of progress on the parallel Gaza peace track as, in his words, hopeful, language that reflects a broader European posture. Relief at any sign of de-escalation, paired with visible anxiety that a new U.S. strike wave against Iran could unravel that fragile progress entirely. France has offered a similarly measured welcome to diplomatic movement, while explicitly conditioning that optimism on actions actually following through on agreements, a diplomatic way of saying we've been here before and promises alone haven't held. In the Gulf itself, the mood is considerably more anxious, and for good reason. Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE are not combatants in the traditional sense. They are host nations, caught geographically and politically between a superpower ally and a neighboring power with a demonstrated willingness to strike their territory. Within the United States itself, this war has not been without domestic controversy. Protests have taken place in multiple American cities since the conflict's opening days in February, with demonstrators gathering outside the White House, some opposing the strikes entirely, others expressing support, reflecting a divided domestic public, even as the military campaign has continued largely uninterrupted by that division. And then there's Iran's own domestic picture, which international human rights observers have flagged as increasingly severe. Independent monitoring groups have documented executions inside Iran linked to protest movements that emerged following the war's outbreak, with reports of individuals executed on charges connected to unrest earlier this year. This matters for our understanding of the conflict because it illustrates something important. Iran is not just fighting an external war against the United States. Its leadership is simultaneously managing internal dissent, economic strain from the blockade, and a population that has, at various points over the past 5 months, taken to the streets in ways the government has met with significant force. I think it's worth being honest here about something that often gets lost in the day-to-day drumbeat of strike and retaliation coverage. Wars like this one rarely stay contained to the two flags most associated with them. What we're actually watching is a conflict that has quietly redrawn the risk calculus for at least 8 or 9 countries who never fired a first shot: Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, and by extension, every economy that depends on Gulf energy exports arriving on schedule. When European foreign ministers use words like hopeful about adjacent peace processes, what they're really signaling is exhaustion. A hope that de-escalation somewhere, anywhere in this broader regional crisis might create momentum that eventually reaches the Iran-US front as well. Whether that hope is realistic is, frankly, an open question that this weekend may go a long way toward answering. So where does this leave us heading into the weekend? 3 things to watch closely. First, whether the reported US strike wave actually materializes, and critically, whether it expands to include Iranian energy infrastructure, a move that would represent a genuine widening of this war's rules of engagement. Second, how Iran responds if that strike does happen. Given Tehran's explicit warning today about retaliation tied specifically to energy targets, any American strike on Iranian oil or gas facilities would very likely trigger an immediate Iranian response against Gulf energy infrastructure belonging to other nations, a scenario that would push global oil markets into genuinely uncharted territory. Third, whether the parallel diplomatic track, the same one producing cautiously hopeful statements out of Berlin and Paris around Gaza, shows any sign of extending toward the Iran front, or whether it remains entirely separate from this conflict, as it largely has been for the past 5 months. To summarize where we stand tonight, this is now day 21 of Phase 2 of the Iran war, with Washington weighing a new strike campaign that could begin within days, Tehran issuing direct warnings about retaliation against energy infrastructure, and a 5-month-old naval blockade that has already cost Iran roughly $500 million daily, while reshaping shipping patterns across one of the world's most critical waterways. Regional host nations remain caught in the middle. Global energy markets remain on edge, and diplomatic channels, while showing modest signs of life on adjacent fronts like Gaza, have yet to produce anything resembling a durable path back from this conflict. We will continue monitoring developments as they unfold and bring you verified updates as this situation develops over the coming days. All information in tonight's coverage has been sourced from verified reporting by CNN, Al Jazeera, and independent monitoring organizations, with links available in the description below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next update.